Well, hello and greetings to all of our Virginia Opera family. We're so delighted to be with you tonight and to have you joining us on all the social media platforms. If you're on YouTube or Facebook, I hope you'll join in the chat feature and as the evening progresses, ask questions and provide any comments that you might have. We're really excited because this is the very first Let's Talk Opera with Josh Borths. And a little bit about Josh. This is his first time with us doing this specific event, and we're very excited. He's actually originally from Cincinnati and now resides in Richmond, a recent Richmond transplant. We're so thrilled that he's a part of our community in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Josh is a stage director, a writer, an educator, and an administrator with well over a decade's experience in the opera industry. He has held positions at Des Moines Metro Opera as a stage director and lecturer, and also at Arizona Opera. He's a professor of music history and also director of opera and musical theater at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. And one of the really exciting things is that later this year, he's actually responsible for our very first animated feature, which will be going out to classrooms all across the state. And that's, of course, a new setting of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. So stay tuned. That's going to be coming out later this winter. But let's give a warm welcome to Josh Borths.
Hello, thank you so much, Adam. It is such a delight to be joining you all here for our first opera talk for the season. Thank you, Adam, very much for that very kind introduction. I want to begin by telling you how I came to fall in love with Wagner. I look forward to getting you to know all of you as the community that supports Virginia Opera. And I don't know if this is your first Wagner experience with Das Rheingold or your 50th. I want to tell you how I got into it. I was on a once in a lifetime trip with my family to visit my brother in Germany. And we went from Germany to Austria, and we arrived in Vienna one day early. I won't go into why that happened, but we found ourselves sitting on the steps of the Vienna Staatsoper, that is the state opera in Vienna. I was a freshman voice student, musicology student. I was in jeans and a t-shirt looking very much like an American, and we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do with our time. And this woman comes out in this big fur coat and she says, "I'm not feeling well." And she hands me her ticket. And I was like, sure, I'll go in. Turns out that ticket was for the royal box, front and center, for a new production of Götterdämmerung, the fourth part of Wagner's Ring Cycle, which Das Rheingold is the first part. I knew absolutely nothing about the Ring Cycle. I knew nothing about Götterdämmerung. I knew nothing about Das Rheingold. And yet, I was on the edge of my seat for the next 6 hours. I tell you this story because there are a lot of barriers of entry to Wagner, whether it's the length, whether it's the mythological subject, whether it is Wagner himself, who is intensely problematic, intensely complicated, and intensely enigmatic. And yet, as my experience shows, what you need to appreciate Wagner is a willingness to lean forward. In about an hour, I'll be presenting a lot of information to you. The purpose of tonight is not for you to memorize it. This is not my music history class. You have no quiz. There's no test. And in fact, I hope by being armed with this knowledge, this will allow you not to remember and regurgitate as you go through your experience of Das Rheingold, but instead, I hope this allows you to relax, to get the most out of your experience, and to really be able to have confidence leaning in to the Wagner performance that you're all about to see coming up later in September. So with that said, I want to now move to how we're going to be structuring the next hour or so throughout our time today with this performance of Das Rheingold. First of all, what is this show, Das Rheingold? What is this thing? Das Rheingold directly translates from the German, the gold from the Rhine being the main river that progresses throughout most of Germany. And this opera concerns the gold that is found at the bottom of that great body of water. And it is the first opera of 4. It is the first of Wagner's ring cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelungs, who are essentially a race of dwarf-like characters. By the way, if a lot of what I say sounds like it's coming from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that's because they draw from similar sources of mythology, the Norse mythology in particular. And there's also a great deal of writing and scholarship that Tolkien certainly knew the operas of Wagner. This work is with the music and libretto by Richard Wagner himself. This was a new development in the 19th century, particularly with Wagner. The idea of one person writing the text, the libretto, and writing the score and orchestrating it, all of that coming from one mind. As we will see as our time progresses this evening, this is going to create a lot of contradictions throughout this work. The Ring itself is one of the largest works in Western civilization. Depending on the conductor, it can take anywhere from 12 to 16 to 17 hours in performance across 4 nights. This thing is gigantic and stemming from one person's mind. The version that you all will be seeing is an adaptation or reorchestration by Jonathan Dove, the English composer, and Sir Graham Vick, who tragically died this past summer, a giant of not only the English theater, but of the entire international opera scene. Now, when I say this is an adaptation, this is not a dumbed down version by any stretch of the imagination. This is simply a reorchestration so that this piece is available to more companies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. The work itself, Das Rheingold, as a part of the larger Ring, takes us from the creation of the cosmos, the creation of the world, the creation of the Rhine, the creation of this gold, to the destruction of the world. You can't get much more epic than the creation of the world to its destruction. The ambitions of this piece are hard to overstate, and therefore creates a lifelong fascination in me for this work at large. And as originally intended and as performed with Virginia Opera in September, it is performed in German and was originally conceived without an intermission. This is the prologue to the larger story that you can experience when seeing the full Ring. It is worth noting at this point that Virginia Opera is treating Das Rheingold as a standalone opera. This is quite common. A number of the Wagner operas of the Ring you can extract in this way. And so really being able to appreciate Das Rheingold is wonderful in this context. So we're going to be developing our content today by looking at 4 basic questions. First, who is Richard Wagner? Maybe you've seen a Wagner opera before, maybe you haven't. But who is this guy? What was his time? What was his life like? There are a lot of myths surrounding Wagner. There's a lot of baggage surrounding Wagner. And so thinking about him in his own context, I think brings him down to the human level, at least as much as Wagner can be brought down to such kind of basic point of view, if you will. So we'll look at the life of Wagner himself. We'll then look at the Ring. What is the Ring? How did this thing come to be? What is it trying to do? We'll then give you some guidance about what to watch for when you're watching the performance and what to listen for in the music. Adam Turner will then be joining us in the conversation and talking about conducting this piece, rehearsing this piece, and what he's excited to share with you all. And then we will allow some time at the end for questions that you all have, questions you've been dying to know about Wagner, questions you have based on the content that is presented this evening, the discussion that we have. Everything is fair game. This is an informal chat, albeit in this virtual context, and I can't wait to get the conversation started. So first, let's dive in to Richard Wagner himself. Wagner was born in 1813. Now that's a really important year when we think about opera history, because guess who also was born in 1813? Verdi. So if you love the operas of Verdi, the operas of Wagner are happening on a parallel German track, if you will, with what Verdi was up to. So that's what's happening in the 19th century. Both of these operatic composers are tracking the development of Europe, the development of their specific national identities as they come into being. This is really important to keep in mind. For Wagner and for Verdi, Germany and Italy did not exist as political countries yet. Italy would not be politically unified until the 1860s, and Germany not until the 1870s. So the idea of Germany as a country did not exist. And so we see in Wagner's life this want to bring about a birth of Germany itself. And you would eventually see that come to fruition a little later on. And we'll talk about how his ideas and his views of that nationhood change over time. He was born in Leipzig, which is a German city and province, and was not immediately seen as a musical genius. He came from a very complicated family. And I always like to mention this when discussing Wagner, because so many opera composers, music composers, were child prodigies. Wagner gives me hope, anyway, that you can be a late bloomer. You can work really hard at your craft, you can have great ideas, and over time develop skills that can literally transform Western culture as we know it. As he fell in love with opera and decided that he wanted to try his hand at being a composer and to devote his life to music, he became very frustrated. I think we can all relate in some way to being young and being frustrated that you're not taken seriously. His first few operas were not successful, but eventually he had a relatively modest hit, a piece called Rienzi, and that allowed him to start to receive court appointments, and he ended up with his wife living in Dresden. His wife at the time, a woman named Minna. Wagner had very complicated, very, we would say, problematic relationships with a number of women throughout his life, and Minna is the first of many. And this location in Dresden changes everything for Wagner. He's starting to be known as a German romantic composer from the Romantic era, and he starts to become involved in politics, and in particular in this idea of Germanness, of a German constitution, of the German people ruling themselves. And in 1849, Dresden joins the many, many other cities and capitals of Europe that in the middle of the 19th century were in the middle of revolution, of revolt. Now, a lot of these revolutions didn't lead to a whole lot of long-term change, but they didn't know that in 1848. It felt like the French Revolution was happening again. Notice this picture. Everywhere you see a little red explosion is a principality, is a place where revolution was coming up, where the people were revolting against their either foreign occupiers, against their monarchs, against whatever government that they had. And Dresden, right up here, a little north of Prague, we have Wagner fighting for his people, for his land. This is when Wagner's political ideas start to really enmesh with his music and creates a tension that from here on out will not be able to be exercised. This revolution sadly didn't lead to German nationalism, at least as far as Wagner was concerned. It was sad. And he was forced to flee to Zurich. So he gets out of Dresden. He and Minna, they go to Switzerland, where he is in exile from his Germanic homeland. And it's in exile, it's in what he considered to be one of the darkest periods of his life, that he really started to think about what it is that he wanted to do with his art. How could his art transform the world? Since clearly his direct political endeavors didn't really lead to much lasting change. And so he started to write, he started to think, he started to study, he started to produce. And during this period, he created a number of works, artwork of the future, opera and drama, all of these works that really thought about how the opera house can be an agent for systemic and radical change. This is also when he wrote some of his most anti-Semitic pieces. And again, I don't want to apologize for that or gloss over it in any way. For this really was kind of out of the norm for his time period. But he was quite provocative, quite kind of in your face about how he wanted to assert the German spirit. And it was during this period, as he's thinking, as he's coming up with these revolutionary ideas, that he begins to structure the Ring. He starts to write the libretti, the text of the pieces at hand. And in Europe at this time, he was known mostly for his writing than for his music. This is important to keep in mind. Most opera composers read Wagner's work more than they heard it. And in fact, Giuseppe Verdi didn't hear a full Wagner opera until pretty late in the 19th century, all things considered. It was his thoughts, it was his ideas that were capturing the European imagination here in the middle of the 19th century, as the revolutions have failed and as Europe was on the verge of, again, another great awakening. During this period, he divorces from his wife Minna and begins a sordid affair with a woman named Cosima. And I bring up this detail because it shows you how tight-knit the musical world was in the 19th century in Europe. Cosima was Franz Liszt's daughter. If you know Liszt piano pieces, this was his daughter. And she was the wife already to Hans von Bülow, who was an incredible conductor and advocate for Wagner's music. So von Bülow is conducting Wagner music as Wagner is reimagining what the opera should be and is having an affair with his wife, who is the daughter of a Liszt. This is incredibly complicated. Wagner defies easy dichotomies or easy presentations like this that in an hour we'll go through all this material. He defies it because this is all so complicated and so intricate, and therefore so interesting across an entire life of study, of listening, and of enjoying what is happening on the operatic stage. He starts to write the librettis of the Ring cycle, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a moment. And it's also during this period that he writes his music dramas. Now, I don't use this term lightly. This was a term that Wagner created as he's creating his revolutionary ideas in Zurich. Music dramas. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But pieces like Tristan und Isolde, Der Meistersinger von Nürnberg, The Ring, and Parsifal, his last opera that he wrote before his death. So this is the period from 1848 on where Wagner really becomes Wagner. He gambles excessively. He lives life excessively to the point that he was constantly in debt and needed Ludwig II, the King of Bavaria, to bail him out and to see his dreams fully realized. One of those dreams was the creation of the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. This is the theater that Wagner created, designed for the Ring. Imagine someone who is horrifically in debt goes to the king and says, I need you to build me a house for one opera cycle. And it's going to have all these innovations that Europe has never seen before. The force of the personality that must have been there for everyone involved to say yes. Bayreuth is still in existence, and they present a summer festival every year dedicated to the works and life of Wagner. And in fact, this summer, all of those works were put online and may still be available for you to watch if you find this interesting. Look at some of the innovations that Wagner created in this opera house. This was one of the first theaters in Europe that had amphitheater-style seating. There was no royal box like I experienced at the Vienna Staatsoper. There were no tiers that showed you what social status you were or social class you were a part of. Everyone is equal. If this reminds you of the amphitheaters of the ancient Greeks, you're thinking about this the right way. This was a communal, transformative experience in the theater. He also was the first to take the orchestra and put it underneath the stage. If you've ever been to a Broadway show and you can't see the orchestra, that's a Wagnerian development. That is something that he created. He lowered the house lights, which was a new concept in the 19th century, and magic and myth and legend unfolded in front of you in this darkened room with this lit up proscenium with music that seemed to kind of rise from the earth. This sounds like a movie. A lot of film historians credit Wagner for really imagining the film experience before it was even realized through film technology. So an incredibly innovative theater. Here is actually a picture from the original performance of The Ring from 1876. These are the three Rhine maidens who you'll see at the beginning of Das Rheingold. And the stage machinery was really unparalleled at that time. Wagner apparently actually in his original pitch to Ludwig II, said that he wanted to burn down the theater after the first performance. So as the world is destroyed at the end of The Ring, he wanted to destroy the theater, kind of like Burning Man in the United States. Ludwig II and others vetoed that, but it shows us just how ambitious, just how obsessive Wagner was about this work. He died in 1883 of a heart attack in Venice after having just premiered his last opera, Parsifal, a very mysterious, enigmatic, spiritual, religious work. And at the end of his life, he had a lot of kind of apathetic feelings about Germany itself. All of the fire of his youth had kind of gone out, and as he saw German unification actually happen, it didn't really bring him the satisfaction or the sense of fulfillment that he thought it would. He also started to think about religion in different ways, started to think about the world in different ways. And so Wagner at the end of his life is very different from Wagner at the beginning of his life. And I think when we consider someone as problematic as Wagner, we need to really take in mind that he changes. And what do we do with those changes? How did he change? What did he view differently at the end of his life versus the beginning? His thoughts, his writings, his music, including The Ring, actually especially The Ring, left a legacy that would be used across all of Western culture throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. His work, while it is most associated with Nazism, for it was appropriated by Hitler and was played to support the Nazi cause, it was also used by radical left-wing thinkers and artists in the early 20th century as well. The thing to keep in mind, Wagner dies in 1883. So everything that happened in the 20th century, Wagner did not see. And that, I think, is a really important thing to keep in mind. Wagner's nationalism was about wanting Germany to exist. Nazism wanted Germany to take over the world. And again, not apologizing for Wagner's anti-Semitism or his kind of megalomaniac views, but it is just worth keeping in mind the historical context of his life and what then is done with that knowledge and with those ideas moving forward. Love Wagner, hate Wagner. There is not a single artist in the 20th century who was able to escape the influence of his thinking and of his art. And his inheritance is mostly found in music, not just in the innovations of Bayreuth, but in the modern film score itself. Da 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 da. Immediately, you're probably imagining kind of Darth Vader and the Imperial Army of Star Wars coming at you. An entire world is conjured through that short little theme. Well, that's a Wagnerian idea. That is one of his great innovations that we'll be talking about in just a moment. That is called leitmotif, and is the central dominating idea in his musical scores. And so if you love Hollywood, you have to grapple with Wagner. A lot of German composers, predominantly Jewish composers, actually escaped the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany in the middle of the 20th century and settled in Hollywood. And so it was German classical composers who knew the works of Wagner who created the Hollywood sound. And so even today in the 21st century, his influence is still deeply felt in abundant ways. So I've been talking about how radical he is. let's talk about some of those ideas that created this radical change. Yeah, Sarah Tucker just posted in the chat Rheingold, who's one of those German Jewish composers who created the Hollywood sound, who brought on the inheritance of Wagner here. First of all, I want to introduce you to Wagner's idea of Gesamtkunstwerk. What? Gesamtkunstwerk. Woo, well done. I can hear you through Facebook and YouTube. Great. Gesamtkunstwerk is a long German word that means a total work of art. Wagner looked at opera and essentially felt like it was failing itself. It was too many people were involved. It wasn't really transforming lives. It really wasn't doing much. And so he conceived of a total theatrical experience where the sets, the text, the music, the orchestra, the singers, the costumes, the lighting, the props are all coming together to create one unified, transformative work of art. Yep, that is quite ambitious. So he took this idea of this total work of art that came to him through the analysis of Greek drama. So if a lot of this sounds like it's, the stories of Oedipus or the plays of Aeschylus or something like that, that's where Wagner got this communal, transformative, cathartic, total experiences, and created music dramas, specific styles of pieces that brought music and drama, just like the name, into one cohesive work. He didn't like opera. He thought that opera was too loaded of a term. And so we talk about the Ring Cycle, Das Rheingold, as a music drama. He was very interested in myth. There are very few operas that Wagner wrote, Der Meistersinger von Nürnberg being the only one really that comes to my mind, that wasn't about German myth. Again, this idea of the creation of a German state and a German psyche. And he did this not only through his subjects, but also through his libretti, through his text. He utilized a system called Stabreim, which was based on a much older form of poetry that used alliterative first consonants. So as you're listening to Das Rheingold, pay attention to the alliteration that you'll hear throughout. Lots of W's, lots of G's, all of these great consonants coming to the fore, which allowed for his melodies to be, quote, endless. Because there weren't final rhymes that enforced a kind of 4-bar phrase structure of Verdi or something like that, his melodies kind of roll that are fully sung but also aren't arias. It's kind of in this in-between space between declamation and full melodic singing. He also created a new function for the orchestra. The orchestra in Wagner music dramas is the psyche of the work. This is the universe, and it is where the storytelling is really unfolding. And then he did created all these changes through the creation of leitmotif, that term that I talked about with the Imperial March from Star Wars. These are little earworms, little themes that are associated with character, with props, with specific events, with emotions. And whenever those are brought up, that theme rises to the surface. So in a world where you don't have arias, in a world where the text is determining where the melody goes, where you have this primordial ooze of the orchestra, these melodies are what bubble up and give structure and meaning to the work as a whole. This is really important. And what you'll notice is these themes change over time. That's what makes leitmotif different from other musical forms. This changes. We'll talk about some examples of that in just a moment. The Ring itself, he started drafting in 1848 when he began that exile, and used a combination of not just Norse myth, but German folk tales. There are some Brothers Grimm stories that end up in the Ring Cycle, and Greek ideas. The character that you'll meet of Fricka is really more Hera from Greek drama than her Norse equivalent, if you will. One of the reasons that these works are so mysterious and really defy any one person's conception of what they mean and how they function is that he wrote the libretti backwards, but then wrote the score going forwards. What do I mean by that? He started with a piece that he called Siegfried's Tod, or the death of Siegfried, a great German hero from the Poetic Eddas. Here you have a picture of the Poetic Eddas. And then he said, well, this story of this German hero really needs a prequel. Well, that prequel really needs a prequel. Well, all three of these stories actually need a giant cosmic prequel. And that's how you get the 4 operas of the Ring, starting with Das Rheingold, that cosmic prequel. He then wrote the music from front to back, taking decades. So Das Rheingold is the most developed poetry with the most undeveloped music in the Ring. Again, these contradictions are happening all over the places, which allows this to be so mysterious and so beautiful. Wagner also never really edited it himself. So as he went through the composition of the Ring, he really didn't change what he was presenting. And so you get kind of his stream of consciousness from the 1840s all the way to the 1870s. Imagine if you have been writing a novel from your 30s to your 60s and you don't go back and edit anything. Think about how complicated that's going to be. Think about how interesting that is going to be. That is the Ring. He took a multi-year break in the middle of the third opera Siegfried in order to write Tristan and Isolde, that little ditty, and shows us just how the Ring was constantly with him as he's developing these ideas of leitmotif, of Gesamtkunstwerk, and of telling the myths of the German past through the orchestra and through spectacular, endless melody. The Ring itself eventually premiered in 1876, and enigmatically, Wagner said about the premiere, if I would do it again, I would do it completely differently. This, to me, gives license for directors and conductors and companies to really explore what the Ring is really about and bring out some of these themes, because no one production can fully explore this work. And so I think it's amazing that we'll be seeing this at Topgolf. Why not? What an incredible theatrical experience worthy of Wagner doing it completely differently and in embracing his own time and place as we embrace our own time and place. In Das Rheingold specifically, as we start to turn to this work alone, we have a lot of themes, and these are just some of them. We have the idea of creation and of nature versus man. While there are no human characters that you will meet in Das Rheingold, they all act in very human ways that we can recognize. And what happens when nature is defiled? Sound familiar? Here's a theme that we can draw out of this work into our modern life. The idea of contracts and legality versus morality. We can probably all think of examples in our lives where what is kind of the law as written or the rule as it is stated and what is morally correct are sometimes ambiguous. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually said that The Ring was one of her favorite operas for this very reason, for it dealt with the line between what is legal and what is moral, what is ethical. It deals with corruption. It deals with contracts. Everyone sitting and watching Das Rheingold at Topgolf later in September will be able to pull different things out of this work. That is why so many people are so obsessed and spend their lives devoted to the works of Wagner, despite the problematic nature of its creator. So what is this story itself? What actually will you see? You will see an opera that is told in 3 scenes with a prologue. Wait a minute. Josh, you just said that The Ring itself was 3 operas plus a prologue. Valkyrie, Siegfried, Götterdämmerung with Das Rheingold as a prologue. Yeah, Das Rheingold is the entire Ring in miniature. We get an opening prologue and then 3 connected scenes. In that prologue, we get an orchestral beginning that takes us from the key of E flat major, this kind of time before the Big Bang, if you will, this kind of primordial space. And over time, we go through the creation of harmony through the overtone sequence, creating triads, creating Western music itself as it builds and it builds and it builds. And eventually we get the first sounds, kind of the childish babbling of the Rhine maidens. This is the entire creation story of Norse mythology in microcosm. I want to take a minute now and just look at 30 seconds leading from this intense creation of the world, creation of the River Rhine, into the singing of the Rhine maidens. You will hear two leitmotifs, two themes throughout. You'll hear the theme of the Rhine building upon itself, and then the theme of nature. It's worth noting these names of these leitmotifs Wagner did not give to these melodies. These were given after. So the actual interplay between all these leitmotifs is a little more loosey-goosey, if you will, than we sometimes care to admit. Here is the beginning of Das Rheingold. So those are two of the leitmotifs and bring us from the creation of the world to the creation of language into our story. Just one short little example. The production clips we'll be watching, by the way, are from 1976 from Bayreuth. This was the centennial production of The Ring, directed by Charot, a wonderful modernist theater director. So if you're curious what you'll be watching, this is not what the Virginia Opera production will necessarily look like, but this is one of those legendary broadcasts of The Ring. And we meet these Rhine maidens. These are kind of water nymph, mermaid, Lorelei kinds of figures that you get in a lot of German mythology, and they are protecting the gold that has been undisturbed at the Rhine, this powerful, beautiful piece of nature. And along comes Alberich. Alberich is a dwarf, and he wants to find love. And so he tries to flirt with these Rhine maidens, kind of like a little kid trying to find friends in the playground. This is all about childhood. This is all about innocence, and eventually innocence lost. And we find the Rheingold itself, and Alberich becomes obsessed with it. Here is the leitmotif of the gold. So that theme, Rheingold, Rheingold, you will hear anytime that gold is mentioned. This is a great example of that leitmotif, and we'll see in just a moment how that theme changes. Remember, leitmotifs change, they shift, they're a part of this primordial soup. Alberich then determines that if he can't have love, he will renounce it and steals the gold from the Rhine maidens, a kind of inhuman, unnatural act, and takes it for himself. And he crafts the Ring of Power, our titular character for the Ring cycle. It's at this time that we jump ahead maybe a day, maybe centuries, maybe millennia. It's really unclear how much time passes. And we move to the world of the gods. And the main god, Wotan, is in the middle of a contract negotiation. He is building his castle Valhalla. If you know the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the world of Loki and Thor, yeah, that's the same Valhalla that is presented in that mythology. And he has contracted two giants in order to build Valhalla. And in payment, they will get Freya, one of the other gods, and the beloved of Fricka, Wotan's wife. Freya, however, produces golden apples that keep all of the gods immortal and young. And so Fricka freaks out. How can you give up Freya? This is horrible. And so Wotan has to work with Loge, the kind of mischievous Loki god of fire, if you will, to figure out how to trick, how to work around the contract to pay for Valhalla. They end up going down into the world of the Nibelheim, down into the world of Alberich, who has created a somewhat totalitarian environment with the power of the ring and with the Tarnhelm, which is a magical object he's created with the ring that allows him to take any appearance that he wishes. Wotan and Loge trick Alberic, they bring him up, and long story short, as you will see, they end up paying for Valhalla with giving up all of the Rheingold that Alberic stole, which Wotan then steals and gives to the giants, and eventually the ring. Wotan doesn't want to give the ring to the giants. However, Alberic curses the ring and says that anyone who has it will be doomed to die. And Erda, the goddess of the earth, tells Wotan give up the ring, and so he does. And immediately, Fasold and Fafnir fight, and one kills the other. Brother kills brother for the ring, and the curse proves to be true. And so at the end of the ring, as the gods go off to the world of Valhalla, we're left with a somewhat sinking, cynical feeling that what we're not seeing is actually a beautiful sunrise, but actually a beautiful sunset on the world of the gods. And what will then happen in the subsequent operas is we'll see the world of man grapple with the mistakes, with the limitations of the gods, and create a new world order through the destruction of the old. This is revolutionary. This is big. This is epic. This is cosmic. I didn't mention one of the characters listed here. My apologies. The character of Mima is an important dwarf. He is actually the same race as Alberic, who has been abused by Alberic in the world of the Nibelheim, and he will eventually raise Siegfried in the third opera. So he's an important character in this wider lore. This is a vertical opera, taking us from the depths of the Nibelung up to the realm of the gods, in between to the world of land with the Rhine maidens as we go. Now, I mentioned that leitmotifs change throughout the course of the operas. And by the time you get to the third and fourth operas, there are sometimes hundreds of leitmotifs happening all at the same time. The consciousness, the melodies that you have absorbed, the melodies that have changed are swirling all around you. Here is a simple way that these leitmotifs change. You may remember that I played just a couple minutes ago that Rheingold, Rheingold, da 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 melody. Very happy, very bouncy, very natural. At the very end of the opera, as the gods are about to head off on their rainbow bridge to Valhalla, we get that same melody, and notice how it sounds this time. Notice that, like, that minor feeling at the very beginning, it's a change. The Rheingold has been stolen. They are no longer happy about the Rheingold. They are lamenting it. And so we hear that harmonic change. That is just one small way that these leitmotifs operate throughout Rheingold and the rest of the ring at large. Again, people become obsessed with tracking different leitmotifs, how Wagner derives theme from theme from theme, just as someone might analyze the score of the movies of Lord of the Rings or the John Williams scores of Star Wars. That is the Wagnerian conception of music and drama. So those are some ways to think about all of this and to think about the music that you are about to hear. I want to play you one of my favorite leitmotifs before bringing Adam Turner back into this conversation to talk a little bit about the specific production that you will be seeing. Here is the theme of the Nibelheim, of the world of the dwarves. And notice how the crafting of the ring, the metalwork, is heard here in the orchestra. I think this is just a fantastic piece of music. So thank you for indulging me here for about 30 seconds. So that's the world of the dwarves. That is the soundscape that we are living in there. And bonus points for anyone who heard our Rheingold theme. Da da. Very sinister there in the orchestra. You can hear the layering of all these themes throughout. Again, incredibly complicated, enigmatic work. Wagner himself did not fully realize what he had created. As I mentioned, the performance you will see was adapted by British composer Jonathan Dove, an operatic composer in and of his and they created this with Graham Vick about 30 years ago in the early 90s. And I actually was just communicating with Jonathan Dove over Facebook a couple days ago, and he says hi, and he is delighted that this adaptation that has allowed companies who aren't doing the full ring or have slightly different circumstances and aren't able to do the full orchestration and the full version can still bring this story, this music to audiences all around the world. So even though this is an adaptation of Das Rheingold, it is still the same opera. It's still in German, still the same language, albeit with just a slightly different orchestration. Here are some pictures of what you will experience, of kind of the rendering. You may have seen this on Facebook, of what we will experience in this epic Bayreuth style performance at Topgolf, and all of the modern costuming, highly imaginative, created by a wonderful costume designer and stage director, Mary Birnbaum, who is directing this production, bringing a female perspective to the world of the ring. So with that said, I would love to go ahead and bring Adam Turner back in. Can you talk to us a little bit of kind of how's it going? How are rehearsals? How is it bringing the world of Wagner to the stage here at Virginia Opera?
Well, Josh, that was fantastic. I'm just enthralled learning so much from you in this in the past 40 minutes. Is incredible. This production, I want to talk just briefly about what you mentioned. Jonathan Dove, Graham Vick's this edition of Rheingold and creating accessibility for opera companies that might not be able to produce the full ring cycle. Rheingold features an orchestration of about 100 players. I remember being a young assistant conductor alongside a young assistant director, Mary Birnbaum, in Seattle Opera. That's where we first met back in 2013, and we were both assistants on the ring. And I got to step into that pit one day. 100 musicians. It's a huge pit that goes underneath the stage and can accommodate so many players. Even our pits in the Harrison Opera House and the Carpenter Theater, they can accommodate maybe 40 to 50 players, and then people are elbowing each other and unable to play their instruments. So this edition, this reorchestration, imagining of Das Rheingold by Jonathan Dove and Graham Vick allows us to capture the spirit of the piece. Most of the notes are there. I have to be perfectly honest with you. The piece itself, Das Rheingold, depending on the conductor, times out at about 2:15 to 2:30, 2 hours and 30 minutes. Ours is just around 2 hours, so there's really not that much music removed. You're getting a fully realized Das Rheingold, and so the production. What can people expect? Gosh, fabulous singing, number one. We've been working with the cast for the last week and a half, 2 weeks, and I'm here to tell you these are some of the finest Wagnerian singers in the country, and possibly the world. Some of them are just so incredible, and many making their debuts with us. And you're going to capture the spirit of the drama. All of it's going to be out on that field. It's just going to be completely different than anything you could have imagined in an opera house. It's epic. It's monumental. It's the grandeur and spectacle that you expect at the opera house. It's just put out on a football field. Think Beyonce, think like halftime show or Olympic, these spectacles with flags and banners and all of that. And then you throw in the golf themes and all that brings to mind. It's
Talk
going
about
to be
playing with social status and politics
exactly.
and hierarchies and all of these things. Amazing.
Exactly.
Good. Yeah, I think Wagner would be very pleased with where theater has gone. I think he would see a Beyonce halftime show and be like, that's what I was going for. I mean, that's a Gesamtkunstwerk, right? That's this total theatrical experience. I want to remind everyone, if you want to go ahead and put on the chat any questions you have, anything you want us specifically to talk about, I am all for it as we get this conversation going. So Adam, you mentioned that you assisted the Ring in Seattle. Can you talk a little bit about your own journey with Wagner and how you relate to this music and to the worlds that he creates?
Well, Josh, I think the very first time I ever heard any Wagner would have been in Looney Tunes. I don't know if do you remember this Elmer? Yeah, yeah, Elmer Fudd, and Bugs Bunny and those iconic scenes. And I remember that watching that as a child, and then just little themes kind of percolating in commercials and movies. And anytime I watch Star Wars or Star Trek or you hear these kind of epic themes, very big and bombastic and brassy, and you talk about endless melody. I think of a lot of themes of John Williams in Star Wars that call that to mind. But eventually in the early 2000s, I may have seen my first Wagner opera, and I believe it was The Flying Dutchman. And that's a youthful piece. That's one of Wagner's early works. I mean,
you weren't a music drama yet.
No, he was like 25, 26 years old when he wrote the piece, but already you can hear the promise that, and it was very exciting. Then when you get to these bigger works, when I got to Seattle and got to assist the Ring cycle, hearing this incredible orchestration, this incredible singing, huge theater, what these voices are capable of doing, projecting over top of, a 100-piece orchestra. It's really, I think Renee Fleming calls it controlled screaming or something. It's this cultivated. I don't know how singers are able to do it, but that's what I'm so awestruck by all the time, working with these talented performers, in that they are capable of phenomenal strength and endurance. And the other thing to think about is a lot of these Wagner operas, sometimes they're 5 hours long. So singers are just on stage endlessly having to sing over an orchestra. With Topgolf, it's under 2 hours, so they don't have to work too hard. And the weather's going to be perfect, so there's nothing there. So it's interesting, but once you catch the fever, it doesn't leave you. I have a bookshelf full of biographies and writings and all the scores. I mean, you can't stop once you catch that fever. And I think you and I were talking about a book that came out this past year by Alex Ross called
I have it right here.
Here's a plug for Alex Ross's book, Wagnerism. And that's right. I read it over Christmas, and it's like obsessed, and his influence on culture, and not politics. Just German culture, politics, philosophy, the orchestra, the birth of conductors. I mean, my
and
profession,
stage directors.
And it's incredible the amount of influence he had in the late 19th century, but it extends all the way to today.
Yeah, I also want to get, if you're now intrigued, if this discussion of Wagner, the man, the music, the Ring, Das Rheingold, Adam's personal experiences attesting to how this music can get under your skin. I also highly recommend, there are like graphic novel versions of the Ring. Here's one. Let me put it up to my camera. Here's all kinds of craziness happening in graphic novel form. Like, there are all kinds of ways to really get into this mythology, and again, to grapple with what Western culture has been doing for essentially the past 150 years. Adam, is this Virginia Opera's first Wagner performance?
It's not our first Wagner. It's our first Das Rheingold. We've performed over the years. Certainly, since I've been here, we've done The Flying Dutchman. In fact, I conducted that production. I had a good time doing that. And previously, there was a production of Die Walküre, which was cut. It was in a very, very cut version, because it has to be under 3 hours or you go into overtime. And that was with Joseph Ricchigno back in, I think, 2010. And then we've done Tristan, also in a cut version at some point before my time. But we have a history of doing these works, never Das Rheingold or the rest of the Ring cycle, which, who knows what this moment is signaling. I think
Gute Dämmerung at Topgolf. That's what I'm saying.
Josh, I was just thinking about this in the last year and a half or so since COVID began, and we've all kind of had to deal with the ramifications of COVID in our ability to perform and produce opera with our normal mechanisms. I've seen people get so creative and innovative. In Berlin, in fact, at the Deutsche Oper in Berlin, they produced this version of Das Rheingold in their parking lot with crazy costumes and whatnot.
Michigan
But
Opera Theater did Götterdämmerung in a garage.
yes, I was
Like
just
a
you.
city garage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It was like
it's amazing.
different instrumentation and orchestration. And what I think is fantastic about that is it's allowing us to get out of the opera house, take opera to the community, show people that it's not this elitist art form. It's really accessible music. And I think once you give Rheingold a chance, once you give this Wagnerian bombast, once you give it a chance, it's incredible. It's dramatic. These themes, these motifs, these leitmotifs that you were talking about, they will be stuck in your head for days.
Yep. And in fact, for many people, The Ring is opera. If you've ever seen those of you watching, if you've ever seen the caricature of, the Viking helmet, like that's The Ring. Like that is what this thing is in many people's conceptions, which is pretty cool. And I think there's something to be said for all of these companies in Virginia Opera being, first and foremost, the ambition to do this piece coming out of the past year and a half that we've had. I think that is operatic ambition that is worthy of Wagner, which is really kind of fun to experience. So you've conducted Flying Dutchman before. What is it conducting The Ring versus maybe some of those earlier works? How do you see Wagner having changed, and do you approach it in a different way? Also, quick plug, anyone who has any questions, more than happy to keep talking, but also would love to hear what you're thinking as we go as well. Adam?
Some of those early works are so inspired by bel canto, and he was actually a big fan of Bellini, and some of the French school as well. But he some of those early pieces, they're more set. There's an aria, and then there's a moment for applause, and then there's an ensemble, and then there's a moment for applause, and they're very clear moments where there's a pause, and formulaic in nature. These pieces, the Ring cycle, Tristan, these works are more through composed, and so you're literally conducting. This show I'm conducting 2 hours just nonstop. I'm just standing there going nonstop. There's never a break. And that's very different. I think in most Puccini operas, most Verdi operas, an act is about anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour, depending on what act it is. I think the first act of Bohème is like 40 minutes. It's these are short bursts, and then you get a moment to breathe. With a piece like Das Rheingold, you really have to be thinking about the pacing, the overall, what the audience is experiencing, and keeping the drama moving forward. And that's actually one thing that Wagner said in one of his writings that I've thrown at the cast every once in a while when I feel we're getting a little sluggish or dwelling on an area. I say, Wagner, he said, this piece should be done in under 2 hours if you numbskulls would just perform it at my tempi. So you just give yourself permission to keep it moving along.
Amazing. There's a great question that just came in from the chat. Have any Wagner pieces ever been turned into movies?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that certainly some have been used in film. A number. I mean, think of the.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say what immediately comes to mind is not so much Wagner adaptations, although there certainly are DVDs you can buy of stage productions. Sure. But his music being used most famously probably in Apocalypse Now.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry, I stole it.
Yeah, think of the helicopters. That's just such an iconic moment in film.
Yeah.
And there are many others. The Liebestod from Tristan und Isolde has been used in all kinds of films.
Speaking of Virginia, the opening of Das Rheingold, the kind of E flat that we talked about and listened about 30 seconds of, is used in the beginning of the movie of the New World, depicting kind of the first Europeans coming over to the New World, by Terrence Malick. Yeah. And interestingly, for those of you who are film historians out there, in the world of silent films, where you'd have an organ, they actually weren't silent. You'd have an organist playing along with the improvising along with the movie. There were these books of just leitmotifs that they would then use to improvise to create their organ scores to whatever silent movie was happening. So there's a countless number of movies that have incorporated not just the ideas, but also the literal music itself, which I think is pretty cool. Again, we don't think about Wagner in film, and yet that's where we feel that presence most strongly in the 21st century.
You know, it's funny, Josh. There was when Das Rheingold begins with that low E flat, this kind of, you barely hear it. I mean, that's the way it should be. It's like, I hear something rumbling beneath me. What is that? And then a B flat, a fifth on top of that, and then eventually a third, and so it's basically the harmonic series. You know, it just goes through all the harmonic series, the overtones and whatnot. And then it just starts cascading, and then into what you showed earlier with the Rhine Maiden just coming up with the first things you hear is a woman's voice just in gibberish, water nymph text. Who knows what it means, but via vaga. And I think about, this incredible music. It's the incredible score. When we visited Topgolf, did a site visit early on, my biggest concern was there's going to be a semi going by on the interstate that's going to play like an E natural, or so, like a half step away from that E flat. But I'm assuring our audience members that will not be a problem. We have everything's amplified and mic'd. You will hear all the singers. You hear the orchestra. It'll be very powerful, and you won't notice any
lifetime
semis.
Experience, just as Wagner intended. We are now at 8 o'clock. Adam, thank you so much for being here and kind of sharing your insight into this production. Again, I hope that you've enjoyed this kind of rundown of Wagner's life, Wagner's work, his music, how to grapple and maybe think about this music in a different way. And all of this is to give you confidence that when you sit down at Topgolf to see Das Rheingold next month, you can relax and give yourself over to this unique operatic experience. Thank you all so much, and I can't wait to see you all in September for the performances of Virginia Opera's Das Rheingold. Bye, everyone.
Bye.